आपके पिताजी हमारे देश के विदेश मंत्री हैं जयशंकर साहब। देखने का एक नजरिया ये भी होगा कि इंडिया के एक्सटर्नल अफेयर्स मिनिस्टर का बेटा क्या लिख रहा है।
नहीं, people are going to say that. I don't think there's anything controversial. I would say the same thing if I would write exactly the same thing if my father was not the external affairs minister.
Do you think कुछ एक्स्ट्रा स्क्रूटनी होती है इस वजह से?
Some things I don't get into. This book is not about domestic politics in India. I don't comment on that.
सैन्य तैयारी कैसी हो, मिलिट्री प्रिपेयर्डनेस कैसी हो, जरा इसके बारे में बताइए।
But it's very difficult to do. It's going to take time. The question is, do we have that time? And that is.
You said manage competition with China. इसको थोड़ा explain करिए सर।
So I think the first problem I think for the world is you have a global power that where decisions are very centralized and very opaque. We had a foreign minister that disappeared in China, so
उनके यहाँ disappear, industrialists disappear हो जाते हैं,
yes,
minister disappear हो जाते हैं.
So when again, if China was an isolated country, that's an internal Chinese matter. But the fact is, these decisions today have implications for everybody else, including us.
क्या बढ़िया होता, कुछ लोग कहते हैं कि इंडिया अमेरिका का दोस्त बन जाता तो पाकिस्तान नहीं बन पाता, और मार्शल अयूब के दौरान जो उन्होंने रैपिड इंडस्ट्रियल ट्रांसफॉर्मेशन किया वो नहीं हो पाता.
The critics who say who want to criticize it because it is associated with Pandit Nehru. In theory, it was a good idea. In practice, it proved sometimes too clever by half.
आप ये हिमायत कर रहे हैं किताब में कि ऑप्टिक्स एक तरफ, आपको एक सर्टेन लेवल ऑफ एंगेजमेंट तो हमेशा ही पाकिस्तान से रखना पड़ेगा, बीइंग योर नेबर.
Pakistan has since 1947 believed that third party mediation, initially by Britain, then by the US. Others, will help Pakistan as the weaker party and get concessions from India. So India wants to forestall. For India, issues between India and Pakistan must be settled bilaterally.
We don't need किसी और की पंचायत. Was there ad hocism?
No, it was a reaction to.
नमस्कार, मेरा नाम सौरभ द्विवेदी है। ये लल्लनटॉप का सबसे ज़्यादा रोशन कार्यक्रम है जिसका नाम है किताबवाला। किताबवाला में आज की किताब विश्व शास्त्र, इंडिया एंड द वर्ल्ड। इसके लेखक हैं ध्रुव जयशंकर, प्रकाशक हैं पेंगुइन। कीमत है 699 रुपये मात्र। आई एम श्योर ये हार्ड बाउंड एडिशन है, तो अगर पेपर बैक आएगा या किंडल एडिशन होगा तो उसकी कीमत कम होगी। आप में से कई लोग कहते हैं कि हिंदी में किताब बताइए या महंगी बहुत है। जो हिंदी में किताब मांग रहे हैं, मैं उन्हें सूचित करना चाहता हूं कि ध्रुव जयशंकर ने हमें आश्वस्त किया है कि जल्द ही भारतीय भाषाओं में इस किताब का एडिशन उपलब्ध होगा। एक बात, जो लोग किताबों के महंगे होने की शिकायत करते हैं, उनसे मुझे ये शिकायत है कि जब आप एक धातु जिसका नाम सोना है उस पर खर्च करते हैं, जब आप बहुत सारे महंगे विलासी शौक़ मसलन भारी भरकम शादियाँ या महंगे पॉपकॉर्न खाने पर अपने आप को खर्च करते हैं, तब किताब की कीमत के बारे में शिकायत नहीं करनी चाहिए, ख़ास तौर पर तब जब वो 1000 रुपये से कम हो। ये हो सकता है कि संघवाद का, सहकारिता का उदाहरण देते हुए 4 दोस्त मिलकर किताब खरीदें, बारी बारी से पढ़ लें और फिर ऐसे 4 को बढ़ा दें जो अभी किताब खरीदने की शक्ति नहीं रखते हैं। पर किताब खरीद कर पढ़ें, क्योंकि आप में से कई लोग कमेंट बॉक्स में कहते हैं हमको दे दीजिए। ठीक है, हम आपको सलाह दे सकते हैं मुफ्त की, उतना काफ़ी है। बहरहाल, हंसी ठिठोली और समझाइश से आगे बढ़ते हैं, किताबवाला की बातचीत शुरू करते हैं। ध्रुव जयशंकर का रुख करते हैं, जो कि ऑब्जर्वर रिसर्च फाउंडेशन नाम के थिंक टैंक के अमेरिका में एग्जीक्यूटिव डायरेक्टर हैं। ध्रुव जयशंकर ने किन सवालों को टटोलने की कोशिश की है, भारत की विदेश नीति और दुनिया में भारत का रुतबा, और ये सवाल ऐतिहासिक अवधारणाओं को टटोलने की, खंगालने की मांग भी करता है। महान मौर्य राजवंश के समय की स्थिति क्या थी, या और उससे भी पहले जाएं तो वैदिक टेक्स्ट में हमारी स्थिति क्या थी पॉलिसीज को लेकर, भारत के स्टेट्समैन को लेकर, स्टेट्सक्राफ्ट को लेकर। वहां से बात शुरू होती है और 2024 तक आती है। आज़ादी के पहले किस तरह से हमारी नीतियां बदली और आज़ादी के बाद किस तरह से, गुट निरपेक्ष आंदोलन के दौरान क्या हुआ, चीन के साथ टकराव से किस तरह का असर हुआ, खास तौर पर साउथ एशियन कंट्रीज के साथ। 90 के दशक में जब उदारीकरण शुरू हुआ या शुरू करना पड़ा, इजराइल के साथ ताल्लुक शुरू हुए, बॉम्बे में ब्लास्ट हुआ, ऐसी कई घटनाएं हुई। उसके पहले यूएसएसआर का विघटन हो चुका था, कोल्ड वॉर यूनिपोलर वर्ल्ड में तब्दील हो चुका था, तब की समस्याएं। चीन के साथ हमारा किस तरह का एंगेजमेंट रहना चाहिए, पाकिस्तान के साथ एंगेजमेंट होना चाहिए या नहीं, और उसमें अफगानिस्तान क्यों अहम प्लेयर है। मेक इन इंडिया की बात करते करते कहीं हम किसी किस्म के आइसोलेशन के शिकार तो नहीं हो रहे हैं, तो इन दोनों के बीच बैलेंस किस तरह से बिठाना चाहिए एक ऐसे दुनिया में, एक ऐसे जग में जब अमेरिका रूस लॉगर हेड पर हैं, अमेरिका चीन लॉगर हेड पर हैं, हमारे एंगेजमेंट कैसे होने चाहिए। और वो जो एक अंग्रेजी का वर्ड है प्रैग्मेटिज्म, कि हम अपने राष्ट्रीय हितों के हिसाब से अपनी नीतियां बनाएंगे जो एक जैसी भी रहेंगी लेकिन देशकाल परिस्थिति के हिसाब से बदलती भी रहेंगी। इन सब सवालों के बारे में ध्रुव जयशंकर ने जवाब देने की कोशिश की है। किताबवाला में आपका बहुत बहुत स्वागत है।
थैंक यू।
सबसे पहले तो आप भाई साहब ये बताइए, आपके पिताजी हमारे देश के विदेश मंत्री हैं, जयशंकर साहब, एस जयशंकर, हमारे जेएनयू के सीनियर भी हैं, बहुत सम्मानित। आपके ऊपर एक एकेडमिशियन के तौर पर इस बात का कितना दबाव रहता है कि आप जो कुछ भी लिखेंगे वो आपकी समीक्षा होगी, आपकी मेहनत होगी, आपने पढ़ाई की है इसकी, लेकिन देखने का एक नजरिया ये भी होगा कि इंडिया के एक्सटर्नल अफेयर्स मिनिस्टर का बेटा क्या लिख रहा है।
नहीं, people are going to say that. People are going to think that, and that is fine. I think they should read the book, and after that they can draw their own conclusions. I've tried to be descriptive. क्या हुआ, कब हुआ, and I try to leave it to the reader, particularly the first part of the book, which is the history. Try to leave it to the reader to ask the questions and to draw their own conclusions. The second part of the book is a bit more looking ahead, क्या करना चाहिए. So that is a bit more my opinion. I don't think there's anything controversial. I would say the same thing I would write exactly the same thing if my father was not the external affairs minister. So I think that people should read the book and draw their own conclusions.
Do you think कुछ extra scrutiny होती है इस वजह से?
कभी-कभी होता है, लेकिन again what I've tried to do is describe the world as it is, describe India's place in the world as it is. Some things I don't get into. This book is not about domestic politics in India. I don't comment on that. But a lot of social issues, unless they are linked in some ways, and I touch upon some of them in passing. But apart from that, these are my views.
Lovely. So we'll come to your views. आपका मास्टर्स भी है डिफेंस स्टडीज में। 14 जो प्रायोरिटीज आपने इस किताब में बताई हैं कि देश एक लीडिंग पावर बने, तो ये 14 फील्ड्स हैं जिन पे हमें काम करना है। और उसमें जो पहली ही फील्ड है वो आपके मास्टर्स के सब्जेक्ट से भी जुड़ी हुई है, और वो ये है कि सैन्य तैयारी कैसी हो, मिलिट्री प्रिपेयर्डनेस कैसी हो, ज़रा इसके बारे में बताइए।
So you cannot be a powerful country today or at any time without being able to secure your borders, to provide security for the country at large, and sometimes when necessary to be able to extend that power overseas, to be able to project that power. So are we there? I think India has many advantages. I've listed out what some of those advantages are. We have a nuclear deterrent. We have a navy that can sail, blue water navy. We have a large army, the largest standing army in the world. We have a space capability that not many other countries have. So India has many advantages. But I write about some of the things that are still works in progress. How that defense budget can be spent more effectively and more efficiently. What some of the areas need to focus on. How to indigenize the defense industry. Because ultimately, if a conflict breaks out and you are dependent on other countries for military assistance in a crisis, then you're not able to perform. So Some of the other things, in some ways our military was inherited from the British. And some of the strategic, the structures of the military are colonial era structures. So there has been a recognition now for 20, 30, 40 years that some changes are in order to be a real effective fighting force. And we've seen China make some of those changes already. So China has moved towards joint commands.
Single theater and then unified command.
Yes. They've made many other steps also to have a more professional fighting force. And some of the deficiencies were made apparent in India during the Kargil War in 1999. So I think many governments have understood what some of the challenges are.
Do you think that जो सुब्रमण्यम कमेटी की रिपोर्ट थी कारगिल वॉर पे, उस पे हमने पब्लिक तो की नहीं, एक्ट किया?
No, so the 99 committee, my grandfather was part of. I think what's remarkable about that is that it was made public. Some parts were.
Parts.
Most of it was made public, and it came out the same year. By the end of 1999, it was released publicly.
Part where it has been said, and there's a book by a very renowned journalist, Babeja, who used to work with Hindustan Times, कि इसमें जो क्रिटिकल पार्ट थे कि जहाँ पे वेपन के लेवल पे, बाकी चीज़ों के लेवल पे हमारी कमी थी, जिसका आप भी जिक्र कर रहे हैं कि हमें जो मिलिट्री मॉडर्नाइजेशन की तरफ बढ़ना है, वो पब्लिक नहीं किए गए.
नहीं, but even the parts that are available are quite critical of many things. And after that, the government formed 4 committees to go into more detail. One on border security, one on intelligence, a GC Saxena committee. There was one more on command, I think, defense management. So there were 4 committees that were created after that, group of ministers committees. So I think the recognition has been there, and actually some of the steps have been made. So we have now a chairman, CDS, Chief of Defense Staff. We have a new department in the Ministry of Defense. Department of Military Affairs, DMA. So some of these steps are being taken, but it's very difficult to do. It's going to take time. The question is, do we have that time? And that is.
And then comes the electoral compulsion. क्योंकि आप मॉडर्नाइजेशन के प्रोसेस में अगर बजट एलोकेशन को इस तरीके से कर रहे हैं कि सैलरीज और उनके बजाय वेपन पे, मॉडर्नाइजेशन पे जाए, टेक्नोलॉजी पे जाए, या आप अग्निवीर जैसी स्कीम ला रहे हैं, तो उसके इलेक्टोरल रिपरकशंस हैं.
So these are some of the difficulties of actually putting it into practice. So, but all in all, there are a number of steps that need to be taken. Most are underway, but the question is, are they happening fast enough? But this, I think, is the first fundamental step that needs to be taken by the government.
आपने प्रायोरिटी नंबर 3 से लेके 11 तक जो बताई, वो सारी इंटरकनेक्टेड हैं. Prioritize neighborhood diplomacy, increase assistance and connectivity, secure the Indian Ocean, connect with Southeast Asia, partner with the Quad, manage competition with China, compel Pakistan, engage Afghanistan, reshape the Middle East. इन पे ज़रा एक एक करके बात करते हैं. खास तौर पे ये जो 3 हैं, you said manage competition with China. इसको थोड़ा एक्सप्लेन करिए सर.
I mean, we are going to have competition with China. That competition could get more intense. So 2020, we saw in the last 4 years we've had that. We've had periods where that competition has been better managed because China and India have both taken decisions to try and manage that competition. So that is the goal ultimately, is to compete, but ensure that that competition does not become conflict. India is not the only country trying to do this. US is also trying to do this. Others are trying to do this. They recognize that China is a competition, but they want that competition to be managed without it becoming a conflict. So that requires some level of engagement at different levels. I think attempts have been made to do it at, from normal diplomatic channels up to leadership level. But ultimately, I think it will require China to recognize China will have to better understand the world. And I think a big fear, what we've seen over the last few years, is a China that has actually become more nationalistic, more inward looking in some ways, particularly since the pandemic. it's very hard to engage with Chinese counterparts on some of these sensitive issues and have honest, frank conversations with them. I've taken part in track 2 dialogues with many countries, but it's always very difficult to get your point across to Chinese and believe that they are acknowledging some of the concerns that Indians and others have.
जैसे किस तरह के concerns हैं जो उनको?
I think what I've listed is of the world itself, not just India, has 4 major concerns about China. One, it is a single party state. And decision making is centralized and opaque. If China was an isolated small country, this would not matter. But it is a global power today. And this contrasts even with the US, for all its faults, and I can criticize many things about the US, but you have a very transparent debate, discussion debate. And major decisions, you have to take into account, the president can't just make decisions by himself.
Senate is there, Congress is there.
The media is there. So I think the first problem, I think, for the world is you have a global power that where decisions are very centralized and very opaque. We had a foreign minister that disappeared in China, so
उनके यहाँ disappear, industrialists disappear हो जाते हैं, minister disappear हो जाते हैं.
So when, again, if China was an isolated country, that's an internal Chinese matter. But the fact is, these decisions today have implications for everybody else, including us.
Second, can you speak in Hindi? How comfortable you are?
I would rather speak in English.
Okay.
You can ask in Hindi. I'm happy to.
नहीं, मैं तो हिंदी में ही पूछ रहा हूँ. ठीक है. Your choice.
Second is the second challenge with China is it's a non-market economy. That is, the economy is controlled and managed to a large degree by the state.
But a lot of people की मार्केट इकोनॉमी और नॉन मार्केट इकोनॉमी फ्लरिश तो कर रही है, उनका लॉजिक ये होता है कि वो कैसे कर रही है.
हाँ, but for the rest of the world, you see, let me give you an example. Indian companies are competitive in North America, in Europe, let's say an IT company. These companies don't do much business in China. Why? It's not because they're not competitive. Why is it that India, despite having lower wages, is not exporting to China? Why do we have such a large trade deficit? It doesn't make sense today. And the fact is that there are a lot of non-market barriers, non-tariff barriers in China to foreign businesses.
और हम लोग यूएस के टैरिफ पॉलिसी पे बहुत बात करते हैं, चाइना पे नहीं करते हैं कि चाइना किस तरीके के बैरियर लगा रहा है.
The tariffs, there are a lot of non-tariff barriers. You have to work with the state, you have to work with the government, and even Chinese companies have to. We've seen this with Alibaba. So the fact is, it's a non-market economy.
Okay. Third point.
And when it's the second largest economy in the world, again, it has implications. Third is, it is shown revisionist behavior with India on the border, with Bhutan, in the South China Sea, in the East China Sea, with Taiwan. And it's willing to use these tactics to change the status quo, try to change the status quo.
Up till Philippines.
South China Sea, so Philippines, Vietnam, with Philippines, Brunei, Malaysia, and on some issues with Indonesia as well. So this idea that until 15 years ago, people were saying China is a status quo power. It's not picking fights with other countries, but that's not true. It's shown a willingness to do that. It's undergoing the largest naval buildup in history right now.
Okay.
And the question is, where will that navy be deployed? How will that navy be deployed? So that's, I think, a third challenge. And the fourth challenge is on global governance issues. Many issues that people thought there was agreement and institutional agreement. China is questioning that on the UN law of the sea. They're saying if we can build an island and claim the waters around that island, even though it's an artificial island. The UN,
and earlier the water belonged to the international, I mean, it was open to all.
International waters. So now the UN, the Philippines disputed this in 2016. There was a judgment. The judgment said China was in violation of one clause. China chose to ignore that judgment. But you see what they're doing in outer space. They did an anti-satellite test, which caused debris. India's conducted an anti-satellite test, other countries have, but they've conducted in a more responsible manner to ensure that there's not debris all over the world. You see in the Antarctic region, you see China doing various things, proliferation. In China provided Pakistan with materials that allowed it to build a nuclear missile, nuclear weapons, in violation of international obligations.
Treaties, yeah.
So I think on many issues, China is showing that it's not willing to reform its, to abide by the rules and norms that are widely accepted. So I think these are questions.
Fourth point.
So that's the fourth. So I think revisionism and on global governance as well.
Not paying attention to international treaties and
that even treaties that even
that was the fourth point.
And including some treaties that some of them see on non-proliferation, some of it they did before signing these treaties, but on other issues they have UNCLOS being a good example. They have done it despite being a signatory to UNCLOS.
इसी से रिलेटेड है, इसलिए क्वाड पे बात कर लेते हैं, क्योंकि आपने एक प्रायोरिटी इंडिया के लिए जो 14 प्रायोरिटीज लिस्ट आउट की हैं, उसमें एक है सिक्योर इंडियन ओशन. और जब हम सिक्योर इंडियन ओशन की बात करें तो सबसे बड़ा थ्रेट हमें चाइना से ही है. और फिर चाइना मालदीव में किस तरीके से पुश कर रहा है एक एंटी इंडिया सेंटिमेंट, श्रीलंका में वैसा करने की कोशिश की, म्यांमार में, बांग्लादेश में भी दे आर ऑपरेटिंग, भूटान में घुसने की कोशिश कर रहे हैं, नेपाल में अभी ट्रीटी साइन हुई जब हम रिकॉर्ड कर रहे हैं एक दिन पहले ही. तो इंडियन ओशन और क्वाड, जरा इन दोनों के साथ समझाइए कि कैसे इस चाइनीज थ्रेट को.
I think it's somewhat different. So Indian Ocean, I think, I read also historically it's been an issue for India, which is even a big reason why we had British colonialism, was because the British dominated the Indian Ocean. So suddenly they could, until that point, and as long as there were competing powers in the Indian Ocean, India could play off the various European actors, the British, the French, the Portuguese, the Dutch. Once the British established a monopoly, they were able to colonize the land. So India has a long-standing interest in ensuring that the Indian Ocean is not dominated by any one party. And there were concerns during the Cold War that the US or Soviet Union might dominate the Indian Ocean. So today I think the concern is mostly China. But there are other concerns as well, non-state actors, pirates, the Houthi attacks we saw against shipping in the Indian Ocean. For India, given how much of trade comes through the Indian Ocean, how much of our energy comes through the Indian Ocean, it's vital that India ensures that this is a secure region. So this is an Indian interest. To the extent that India can work with partners that share this view, that's good. Not just the Quad, I'd say France is an important partner in the southwestern Indian Ocean. Australia is an important partner. Sri Lanka, Maldives, Mauritius, Seychelles. So these attempts are being made but again, this is India leading these efforts. The Quad, I think, that is part of what, the Quad has a similar view on this. But I think it's a larger concern extending into the Pacific. And again, the 4 Quad countries at least share an assessment about China and China's role in the Indo-Pacific, and are cooperating together in various ways to address that.
Interesting. Compel Pakistan and engage Afghanistan. आप ये हिमायत कर रहे हैं किताब में कि ऑप्टिक्स एक तरफ, आपको एक सर्टेन लेवल ऑफ एंगेजमेंट तो हमेशा ही पाकिस्तान से रखना पड़ेगा, बीइंग योर नेबर, और फिर आपको देखना पड़ेगा कि वहाँ स्टेट प्लेयर्स, नॉन स्टेट प्लेयर्स, वो सब कैसे प्ले आउट कर रहे हैं, और अफगानिस्तान के साथ बहुत एक्टिव कोलैबोरेशन करना पड़ेगा टू कीप पाकिस्तान इन चेक. थोड़ा ये एक्सप्लेन करें.
So the Pakistan part, I say Pakistan is a revisionist country, a long history of that. They've used terrorism against India, continue to harbor terrorists.
अभी भी कर रहे हैं.
They do it under a nuclear umbrella. So this makes it hard for India to compel Pakistan to stop doing that. So what I suggest is India needs to use carrots and sticks, positive and negative. It needs to be prepared for military contingencies. We saw this with the surgical strikes.
Operation Parakram,
surgical strikes, Balakot, you've seen that. So you need to have military options to compel. You also need to offer attractive your market. So sometimes using trade incentives, using cricket, using other things, you use the carrots and sticks to try and build that up. But it's not going to happen overnight. Pakistan has shown that it's willing to bear considerable losses to keep up this revisionist agenda against India. Now, at the same time, at times there's been a need to engage with Pakistan for two main reasons. One, to forestall, to prevent other parties from coming in. Pakistan has, since 1947, believed that third-party mediation, initially by Britain, then by the US. Others, will help Pakistan as the weaker party and get concessions from India. So India wants to forestall. For India, issues between India and Pakistan must be settled bilaterally.
We don't need किसी और की पंचायत.
Exactly. So that is one reason to continue engagement. Every prime minister has made attempts to try and do that. In some cases, to prevent others from inserting themselves. Further reason is there are many stakeholders within Pakistan as well, and they have different interests. You have a business community, you have the PML, the Nawaz Sharif, the Sharif brothers, you have some remnants of the PPP, you have the army, you have Imran Khan. So you have multiple, and it is sometimes in India's interest to have channels to all of these different parties because of the domestic politics there. So that's another reason to maintain that engagement. But this is not going to be an easy proposition, and I think at best what I suggest at the end is this is about managing a problem for now rather than solving that problem.
And in that management, Afghanistan is a key player.
Afghanistan is important because we've experienced what happens when Afghanistan is allowed to become a haven for terrorists that target India. We saw this in 1999 with the hijacking of an Indian Airlines aircraft. IC-814. It was taken to Kandahar, which was then controlled by the Taliban. And I think that's a very direct example. But there are many other examples. We had an Indian diplomat killed in 2008 when there was a car bomb against the Indian embassy in Kabul.
Right outside the embassy,
So that is, maintaining some form of engagement with Afghanistan is therefore necessary to make sure that it does not become that haven. Whether that involves providing assistance, which India has done, or providing, using different tools, changes with time. So, but that need to continue to play a role in Afghanistan is there.
और ये भी देखना होगा कि बाकी वर्ल्ड पावर वहाँ पे कैसा रोल प्ले कर रही हैं, क्योंकि यूएस निकल लिया, रशिया घुस रहा है,
रशिया और ईरान,
चाइना
पाकिस्तान,
है, ईरान है. इंटरेस्टिंग. मैंने जब प्रायोरिटी गिना रहा था तो एक से सीधे 3 पे आ गया था, 2 छोड़ दी थी, विच इज इम्प्लीमेंट एन इंडस्ट्रियल पॉलिसी. इंडस्ट्रियल पॉलिसी पे बात करेंगे बिकॉज अगर हमें चाइना को काउंटर करना और किसी को ना भी काउंटर करना हो, ओवरऑल भी ऊपर बढ़ना है, तो यू नीड टू स्ट्रेंथन. उसमें आपका एक बड़ा स्ट्रांग ऑब्जर्वेशन है कि दुनिया की कोई भी इकोनॉमी प्रोटेक्शन और आइसोलेशन के दम पे नहीं चली है. थोड़ा उस चीज को एक्सप्लेन करें.
हाँ, so a common thing I hear and I see people in the strategic community in India say India's best foreign policy is 8% growth. Now that's obvious, but that avoids the question of how do you get 8% growth, right? You don't get it by simply ignoring the world. You actually get it by engaging the world. Collaboration. You need investment. You need capital. You need market access. You need to sell something. You need technology. You need talent development, skill development. So for all these reasons, you need to actually engage the world if you want 8% growth. So I think that's a very lazy argument that you hear quite commonly. And there is a isolationist. Why do we need the world? We are 1.4 billion people. This is, I think, a very narrow way of looking at the world. And again, as I argue, no power in history has done so, has grown entirely on its own. Russia, the Russian Empire, you look at what Peter the Great did. He looked to the West and he said, what are the best things we can learn from the Western powers? Let us make Russia a great power. The US benefited from immigration, from technical assistance, from help from many countries, starting with France. The Soviet Union benefited from after World War II as well, particularly in technology. But the two examples I focus on a little bit more. One is because I think they're more applicable. One is Japan after the 1870s, where Japan went on a mission around the world. The government sponsored a mission to negotiate new treaties, but also to learn from the world. And it took them 30 years to modernize. We think it happened very quickly and very easily, but I also look at how there were a lot of difficulties there. The other example I look at more, because it's more contemporary, is China. And I think we overlook some of the difficulties that China, after 1978, went through as its economic modernization. But it would not post-Mao under Deng Xiaoping, but it would not have happened without a great deal of investment via Hong Kong, with engagement with the Chinese diaspora, including in Singapore, without market access to the US and Europe. So it required all of those ingredients that helped make China the great power that it is today. So I'm not saying that India needs to follow exactly those examples. India is different. Its economy is different.
But we have to be open to...
But we have to look at what others did, adapt it for an Indian context. Also understand that it was difficult, that it was not a smooth path. There was nothing preordained about what China did or what Japan did.
आप डिफिकल्टी की बात कर रहे हैं भाई साहब. यूएस के प्रेसिडेंट इलेक्ट माननीय डोनाल्ड ट्रंप, एक तो उनकी भाषा जो है ना, दे कैन गो फाइंड अनदर सकर. और वो कह रहे हैं कि भाई ना तो ब्रिक्स अपनी करेंसी बनाए, ना इन सब को चेंज करने की कोशिश करे, वरना हम 100% टैरिफ लगा देंगे और वो अमेरिकी मार्केट तो भूल ही जाए. तो एक तरफ तो ये बयान है. दूसरी तरफ हमारे प्रधानमंत्री नरेंद्र मोदी, उनका ब्रिक्स समिट का बयान है, वी वेलकम एफर्ट्स टू इंक्रीज फाइनेंशियल इंटीग्रेशन अमंग ब्रिक्स कंट्रीज, ट्रेड इन लोकल करेंसीज एंड स्मूथ क्रॉस बॉर्डर पेमेंट्स विल स्ट्रेंथन अवर इकोनॉमिक कोऑपरेशन. चूँकि हम ये एक वर्ल्ड ऑर्डर में कोलैबोरेशन की बात कर रहे थे, इस तरह की चीज़ों को इंडिया कैसे डील करेगी? एक तरफ लग रहा है कि डोनाल्ड ट्रंप हमारे दोस्त हैं, तमाम ग्लोबल इश्यूज़ पे या हमारे कन्फ्लिक्ट इश्यूज़ पे वो हमारे साथ खड़े हैं, लेकिन उनकी अपनी एक प्रोटेक्शनिज्म वाली पॉलिटिक्स है जिसके बिना पे वो चुन कर आए हैं. कैसे इसको इंगेज करें? और हमारे लिए बाकी प्लेटफॉर्म भी इंपॉर्टेंट है, इंक्लूडिंग ब्रिक्स.
So I think a few things linked together. One, I think Trump likes to create leverage. So he says he's not actually going to apply 100% tariffs on the BRICS countries because it will blow back on the US. Inflation will spike. If you do China at the same time, China, Russia, India, it'll have very detrimental effects for the US economy. He's trying to create leverage and show his unhappiness, which is fine. I think there's also a very strong misconception about some sort of common BRICS currency, which is not going to happen. That we don't have the level of, the euro is suffering, has its own troubles. Imagine Russia and China and India cooperating in that manner.
BRICS currency नहीं, लेकिन local currency में trade तो.
So that gets to what is actually being discussed, which is we've had the sanctions regime that the US and Europe have applied on Russia. They're doing it because of the war in Ukraine. India needs certain things, particularly oil from Russia. We need some way to pay for that oil. Also defense, fertilizers, other things. So I think finding a common basket of currencies that allows for trade amongst some of these countries, not just China, Russia, India, but also UAE, other Saudi Arabia and others, is something that is in the common interest. So that is what they're looking at now. I would take that, that is something India needs to do. It has a diverse set of partners. India is not, unlike Russia and China, not trying to actively de-dollarize, but it does try to trade with particularly Russia, a country that is under sanctions today. So I think it's about finding how to get that done. Trump, I think separately there will be negotiations on some trade issues, including tariffs with India. He believes that India has very high tariffs. India also has to explain that sometimes lowering the tariffs will not benefit America. It will benefit China. It will benefit others in some areas. Also, I think India has to explain that unlike many countries, India is a net importer. India is a consumer-based economy. It does have a trade surplus with the US. But that may not persuade Trump. But I think we're in for some very interesting negotiations with Trump. One thing I was telling somebody else yesterday, I talked to people from lots of other countries, and they look at India and to some degree Japan, and they say, you dealt with Trump well. We want to learn from you how best to deal with
How to deal with Trump.
So I sometimes say it was more complicated than it may seem. But it is interesting that others look to India to say, oh, India knows how to deal with, India has been adept at dealing with Trump in the past.
Interesting. But are we finding it difficult to deal with our neighbors? नेपाल से शुरू करते हैं, है ना? जिस तरह की लिपुलेख और तमाम, है ना, इलाकों में हमने एक हॉस्टिलिटी देखी, वहाँ पे जो रिजीम आ रही है बैक टू बैक कम्युनिस्ट रिजीम, उनका चाइना के साथ इतना एक्टिव एंगेजमेंट है. बांग्लादेश तख्ता पलट हुआ है और अब हम देख ही रहे हैं, चाहे वो माइनॉरिटीज़ का प्रोसिक्यूशन हो या उससे भी बड़ा एक जो और पहले का कंसर्न है वो ये है कि हमारी कॉटन इंडस्ट्री किस तरीके से पूरी वो चीप लेबर और उन्होंने जो भी अपनी पॉलिसीज़ बनाई बांग्लादेश में चली गई, वो एक कॉम्पिटिशन है. श्रीलंका और मालदीव हमेशा हमारे कंसर्न थे और किसी भी देश में अगर इंडिया गो बैक का नारा लग रहा है तो हमारे लिए प्रॉब्लमेटिक है. डू यू थिंक कि एक मतलब ये तो है कि बहुत ही होस्टाइल एनवायरनमेंट है इर्द गिर्द, कैसे डील करें इंडिया इससे?
So a few things. One is I try to show, I devote an entire chapter to the neighborhood.
जी.
And also in the historical narrative, I try to put the neighborhood give it some prominence. क्या हुआ नेपाल में in the 1950s, 1960s, in Sri Lanka, the civil war in Sri Lanka and Nepal maybe, and Myanmar also. So I try to emphasize that because it's an important story to tell, and Indians don't often pay attention to that. So I've done that. One of the things I think you see is that some of these difficulties go back quite a long way, go back almost to independence, sometimes soon after that. So it has not always been easy dealing with our neighbors, and it's become more difficult in some ways because there are a few structural issues. One, these are countries that are very, like India, have a strong sense of sovereignty. And there is growing nationalism, and that nationalism is directed against India as the big country in the neighborhood.
They'd love to portray us as a bully or a big brother.
In their domestic politics, there's sometimes competition to say we're standing up to India for the domestic audience. So that's happening. These are countries that are democratizing. I don't mean sometimes politically, but sometimes socially. You're seeing, even in Bhutan, you're seeing a more vibrant social media space. In Bangladesh, obviously, in Nepal. So you're seeing a more active democratization of these societies. You also have a size disparity. India is much bigger than these countries, and they need India to connect with each other. And they have an option today. They have other options today, one of which is China, but on some issues, US and others. Now, this is the cocktail of issues at stake. How do you resolve that? I think two main lines of effort. One is diplomatic. We have to give these countries diplomatic attention. There was a period of about 10 years when no Indian Prime Minister went to Nepal. It's a 1-hour flight to Kathmandu.
Yeah.
Right? So I think one of the good things that we've seen in the past 10 years is now this has become regular. We have
active cultural, spiritual, industrial.
But at the political level, they want the Indian Prime Minister to come. They want that engagement. They want a state visit here in Rashtrapati Bhavan. So I think that kind of high-level political engagement has to continue. Two, we need to rethink regionalism. We put a lot of stock in SAARC. SAARC was held hostage to India and Pakistan differences. Today, I think there's now an active attempt at looking at other mechanisms.
SARC minus Pakistan.
SARC minus Pakistan, BBIN, BIMSTEC, Colombo Security Conclave, the issue-specific cooperation. So that's another effort. 3, economic engagement and connectivity and assistance. So India needs to be the first humanitarian provider to this, to these countries, because if India doesn't do it, they'll turn to others, and it's natural. India needs to provide.
We have seen that in Sri Lankan crisis, how we reached out.
So I think now, financial assistance to Sri Lanka, providing hydroelectric power from Nepal to India and India to Bangladesh. These are just some of the examples of this underway. Now, the question is, will there continue to be volatility, political volatility in these countries? Perhaps. That's up to the citizens of these countries. There will be changes in government in all of these countries. Some of them will be more predisposed towards cooperative relations with India, some will be less. That's going to happen. We're going to have cycles. But can India use the diplomatic attention, aid, connectivity to moderate the volatility? That is the real test. So when people say, Acha, there's a change in government, new anti-Indian government has come, let's see. I mean, with Maldives, for example, a president that ran on an India out campaign came here and had a very productive bilateral visit just a month or two back. So I think that is a real test of, over time, will India be able to moderate the volatility in its neighborhood?
What about Bangladesh?
Bangladesh is in a difficult place right now. Let's see. It might get, and hopefully it does not get much worse, but it's you've had a very big change, political change there. And it has a history of there's a domestic debate. Debate is putting it mildly. There've been domestic turmoil there, really since 1975.
Khalida Jia ke husband जब वहाँ पे थे.
And you have very different ideologies. One that has emphasized the Bengali identity, one that has
emphasizing on Islamic identity,
and they have contested with each other. So I think again we now have a vacuum with Sheikh Hasina leaving. Let us see what happens, but I think there will have to be some kind of resolution, and let us see how the new government in Bangladesh fares.
ध्रुव, यूजुअली हम लोग जब इंटरनेशनल रिलेशंस पे इस तरह की इंट्रोडक्टरी बुक देखते हैं तब 1947 या मॉडर्न नेशन स्टेट के कंसेप्ट के हिसाब से ब्रिटिश टाइम से देते हैं, पर आप पहले ही चैप्टर में यू वेंट बैक टू मौर्यन एम्पायर, अशोक के स्तंभ, अशोक की पॉलिसीज, चाणक्य, मनुस्मृति, इन सब का जिक्र किया है. थोड़ा उसके बारे में बताइए.
हाँ, सो आई थिंक वन इज there are a lot of misconceptions, some in India, about India, but also a lot abroad about India. And what I wanted to do was contest some of those. I see people say things like India has no strategic culture, and I wanted to show, no, actually there is. You have people know Arthashastra, the Kautilya, but I point to many other examples of people thinking about statecraft. How should states engage with each other, how to govern, how to manage an army.
Sending ambassadors, having ambassadors.
There's a culture of diplomacy going back to more than 2,000 years, 2,500 years. So one is I wanted to document that, not just say that we have it, but actually show that. Some say India is a novel political entity. But actually, I think both outsiders and Indians themselves had an Indian identity of some kind. It evolved over time, but again, going back more than 2,500 years. So I wanted to document that, and I think it provides some context. And again, some of it, and the further point I wanted to make is India, before the arrival of Europeans, before the arrival of Vasco da Gama in 1498, Indians actually had direct and indirect contact with a very large part of the world. With Africa, with the Mediterranean, with Central Asia, with Southeast Asia, with China, and indirectly even further to Europe, to Japan. So,
even during Mughal or Maratha Empire,
and in some cases even before. So we had, one of the things I found, there was an army of 10,000 Africans who were in the 1600s in the Deccan.
Yes.
Yeah, right? So we've had that kind of the amount of Roman gold coins that have been found in India shows the extent of trading networks. In Nagpur, in central India, they found collections of Roman gold coins going back 2,000 years.
It shows active trade.
Active trade. And of course, people know Southeast Asia, the culture, because the cultural link was much stronger. China, there was the flow of Buddhism to China via Tibet, and then on to Korea and Japan. So again, this is a much more cosmopolitan. India was at the center of a very cosmopolitan world, even before the arrival of Europeans.
Chapter 2 में आपके argument भी वही है, second chapter में.
So that I think is what I wanted to stress. That this is not a new. The history of India and the world does not start in 1947. It has history, and it changed over time. Even the colonial period had its own features as well.
एक चीज़ पे बहुत बात होती है ध्रुव, स्पेशली मेडिवल हिस्ट्री के पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू से, कि अगर मुगल्स का ऑटोमन और सफाविद एम्पायर के साथ कुछ अलग किस्म का रिश्ता होता, उतना टकराव नहीं होता, तो वर्ल्ड ऑर्डर कैसा होता, वन. एंड अगर उस टाइम पे, यानी मुगल्स के टाइम या मराठास के टाइम पे, हमने नेवल पावर पे फोकस किया होता, एक्सपीडिशन नेवल पावर, एंड जिसको हमारे यहाँ प्रबोधन कहते हैं, एनलाइटनमेंट, एंड देन दैट साइंटिफिक टेम्परामेंट एंड इंडस्ट्रियल रिवोल्यूशन, जो हमने यूरोप में होते देखा, तो एक अलग ही.
Maybe it's very hard to go into alternative histories.
Yeah.
But I think some things are interesting. Again, with the exception of the Cholas, you never really had an expeditionary seafaring tradition. Even the Marathas had primarily coastal defense and amphibious capabilities. The Mughals never developed a ocean-faring navy to claim territories far afield, although there were trading networks that continued. Why is interesting? I mean, there's some other interesting examples. Indian gun technology was as good, if not superior, to European gun technology in the early 1500s. And yet, for many reasons not entirely understood, Vijayanagara and others decided to abandon development of that. So it's interesting we can think about why, but it is interesting to.
आपने एक जगह टर्म यूज़ किया है 4th चैप्टर में, जो मैंने मार्क किया, एक्सट्रैक्टिव कोलोनियलिज्म. एक तो हमने ईस्ट इंडिया कंपनी और उसके बाद के उसमें देखा, पर जिस तरीके से चाइना अफ्रीका में अपने आप को एक्सपेंड कर रहा है, वो मुझे एग्जैक्टली एक्सट्रैक्टिव कोलोनियलिज्म ही एक नए अवतार में दिख रहा है, जिसमें आप माइंस, मिनरल्स, डेट ट्रैप.
I mean, I speak about it in the Indian context there, but we see that in other places as well. Any place with natural resources, the fear is, it's funny, some of my colleagues were just in Africa, and not just China, they also accuse the West of extractive colonialism, whether it's diamonds or gold or forest products and things like that. So, yes, it's there. The point I want to make with the extractive colonialism, I think we think of that was fundamentally what made the British Raj so different. Again, there are some people, including in the West, who say, well, the British legacy in India was very mixed, and they did so many good things for India and stuff. And so, in some ways, it is pushing back on that. And I'll give you a simple statistic. From 1900 to 1947, the per capita incomes of Indians grew zero. So the only growth we had was population growth. From 1947 on, the day the British left, we had 2% growth year on year for the next few years. So that tells you it's a crude measure, but it tells you essentially this was a 2% annual tax that India was losing. And if you say that, if you apply that for the entire period of the British Raj, India's economy would have been 6 times what it was when the British left. So that is what India lost.
Yeah, given the fact कि हमारे यहाँ कोई एक्टिव थिएटर नहीं था अगर हम पार्टी नहीं होते वर्ल्ड वॉर 1 और 2 का.
हाँ, but even some of it had to do with the war, famine, all of that. But again, the fact is just simple. We had a colonialism tax of 2% annual growth that for 90 years, perhaps even longer.
एक चैप्टर है, दूसरी चैप्टर जिसमें आप नॉन अलाइन्ड मूवमेंट की बात करें. हम लोग जब पॉलिटिक्स की बिल्कुल शुरुआती कक्षाएं लेते हैं, इवन एट द स्कूल लेवल, तो हमें गुट निरपेक्ष आंदोलन के बारे में कबूतर उड़ाते नेहरू, एक अल्टरनेटिव वर्ल्ड ऑर्डर, और हमें ये सब नाम याद कराए जाते थे, मार्शल टीटो, कर्नल नासिर, बाडुंग सम्मेलन, ये सब चीज़ें. इसको लेके बहुत क्रिटिसिज्म भी होता है कि क्या बढ़िया होता. कुछ लोग कहते हैं कि इंडिया अमेरिका का दोस्त बन जाता तो पाकिस्तान नहीं बन पाता, और मार्शल अयूब के दौरान जो उन्होंने रैपिड इंडस्ट्रियल ट्रांसफॉर्मेशन किया वो नहीं हो पाता. और कई लोग ये भी कहते हैं कि इसीलिए हम डेथ ऑफ नॉन अलाइन मूवमेंट देखते हैं कि तगड़ा ब्लो लगा 62 में जब आप चाइना से हार गए, आप झुंझुना बजाते रहे गुट निरपेक्ष का, और 65 तक तो फिर वो पूरा खुल ही गया. हाउ डू यू लुक एट इट?
So, the discussion on non-alignment has become very politicized.
Yes.
Obviously, you have some see it as a legacy of Nehru, and it's very much associated with the personality of Nehru, and therefore it has a certain resonance today. The second is you have the critics who say, who want to criticize it because it is associated with Pandit Nehru. Where I come out on it in the book, and I try to describe again what happened and what the intention was, is I think it was intended in a certain way. And true non-alignment really only lasted for a very short time period, which was 1953, when India began to have economic relations with the Soviet Union. 55, it really happened in 55, but after Stalin's death in 1953, that started. People forget that 1947 to 1953, effectively India was dealing more with the Western bloc, with the UN, US, Britain,
Germany,
Europe,
France.
Germany. That was the source of finance, source of technology. So after 1953, particularly after 1955, Khrushchev's visit here, Russia became a partner, a potential partner. And it lasted until 1962, maybe 1965. But that was quite a brief period where true non-alignment was attempted. And India tried to there was a brief period, early 1960s, where India was the largest recipient of US aid anywhere in the world. And it was the largest non-communist recipient of Soviet aid. So many looked at, this is very
कैसे मैनेज किया?
कैसे? Now, the question then is, why did that all come crashing down? Because in 1962, when India needed help, it got no help from the Soviet Union, it got no help from America, well, not until it was too late. So, again, what looked very clever became
Harakiri.
So, I think that's what I try to describe, what was non-alignment in theory, in practice, how it was actually more difficult in practice. But the reality is, after that, even though India used the term non-alignment, fact is, 1971, we had a treaty with the Soviet Union. We were aligned. 20 years of this Cold War, India was on one side of the Cold War.
Another side was US, China and Pakistan.
US, China and Pakistan. Yeah. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. That was the reality India had to deal with. But the fiction remained that we are non-aligned. And of course, India took a more active role in the non-aligned movement. In 1983, hosted the summit here in Delhi. But I think the non-alignment needs to be critically examined in this way. Again, where I think I come out on this is that in theory it was a good idea. In practice, it proved sometimes too clever by half.
Yeah, and that is why we had to rework on our global strategy, especially 1970 से 1990 के बीच के दौर में, जब हमने एक डिसाइसिव वॉर लड़ा पाकिस्तान के खिलाफ. न्यूक्लियर पावर बने हम, और सैंक्शंस की हमने ज़्यादा परवाह नहीं की. हालांकि टेस्टिंग के बाद हमने कुछ साल का ब्रेक दिया न्यूक्लियर डेवलपमेंट को, और एक किस्म का इंगेजमेंट दिखा चीन के साथ भी 62 के बाद. हॉस्टिलिटी भी दिखी, इंगेजमेंट भी दिखा, और फिर एक बड़ा ऐतिहासिक बताया दौरे को. आई स्टिल रिमेंबर इंडिया टुडे के कवर पे फोटो छपी थी जिसमें राजीव गांधी चाइना वॉल कि वहाँ पे खड़े हुए हैं, वो कैप लगाए
1989 में।
यस। तो ये किस तरीके, क्योंकि बहुत सारी चीजें हुई, मतलब बाय द एंड ऑफ दैट 80s का यूएसएसआर, दे हैड टू गो आउट फ्रॉम अफगानिस्तान एंड देन द कोलैप्स ऑफ सोवियत संघ.
So all of that I document in the book as
Yes.
So I mean, one, I devote quite a lot of attention to the nuclear program, and I think a big mystery is after 1974 to 1983,
We expect nothing less, sir. Again, I'll remember your father and our nuclear policy. Please continue.
So that I think it's again, it's people forget it. You know, I'm 41 years old. For me, professionally, the coming of age is to 2005. India and US signed a nuclear agreement, and I was living in Washington I was in Delhi actually for some of that part, but also in Washington, and there were very big debates about that in India.
A lot
of debate. And I,
1, 2, 3 agreement, IAEA,
exactly.
this clause, that clause.
So for me, that was very formative in my professional development. But I talked to my colleagues who are 10, 15 years younger than me, and they don't remember all of this. So the struggles that India had to go through to normalize its nuclear program,
including a floor test.
It had it was the first time a foreign policy issue like that had such significance in Parliament, that the survival of a government depended on it. So again, I am quite surprised sometimes that younger people are unfamiliar with that. So I have devoted quite a lot of attention in the book to the nuclear program.
लिबरलाइजेशन, मतलब आप चूंकि लगातार ये बात कर रहे हैं कि सब चीज़ें इंटरकनेक्टेड हैं, आप ग्लोबल पावर बने, आपकी इंडस्ट्रियल डेवलपमेंट, आपका मार्केट है, आपकी इकोनॉमी, आपकी सॉफ्ट पावर, किस तरह से उसने बदला वर्ल्ड ऑर्डर में हमारी पोजीशन को, मतलब इट ओपनड अप द डोर, दुनिया के लिए हमारे दरवाजे खुले और हम भी दुनिया में अब ज़्यादा पहुँचे.
I mean, I point to 1991 as a pivotal point. For the economy was one part of it. Soviet Union collapsed. India's most important partner dissolved. We had a balance of payments crisis, so the economy was forced to liberalize. We had the assassination of Rajiv Gandhi and political turmoil. 2 years after that, we had the terrorist attack, Dawood Ibrahim, and D Company, we had the attacks. We had a flaring up of the insurgency in J&K at that time. So all of these things came together, mostly 91 or a few years before or after 91. And it was a period of some anxiety for India at that time. We also, IPKF, India had pulled out from Sri Lanka. It was not an easy time. And you had a relatively weak prime minister in the sense of a weak electoral mandate, Narasimha Rao, and had to start rebuilding after that. I think the economic side, it didn't happen. The success of 91 was not immediately apparent. It actually was after late 1990s, that we had the software boom, driven in part by the Y2K issue. Which again, when I talk to younger people about it, they think this is bizarre. We all thought computers were going to shut down at midnight.
मसला ये था, बात ये चलती थी कि चूंकि सारे कंप्यूटरों में दुनिया के, ये 2000 के आमद से पहले की बात है, तारीख डबल डिजिट में ही लिखी है. तो अगर तारीख है से 1 जनवरी 1999, तो है 01/01/99. तो मसला ये आया कि कहीं ऐसा तो नहीं होगा कि आखिरी में जब 2000 का साल आएगा तो लास्ट की 2 डिजिट 0 की हैं, तो सारे कंप्यूटर ठप पड़ जाएंगे, पूरा वर्ल्ड ऑर्डर कोलैप्स हो जाएगा और एक किस्म की अफरा तफरी मच जाएगी. इसी को Y2K प्रॉब्लम कहा गया था. ये बहुत मैंने आपको सिंपल करके समझा दिया जी.
But that was what prompted suddenly the world.
जेनिफर लोपेज का गाना भी आया Y2K.
I forgot that part, but suddenly the world needed trained engineers.
Yes.
In short order, and suddenly, we think, why do we have TCS and Wipro and Infosys? It was thanks to this combination of factors that came together. Yes. We had IIT trained engineers. We had these companies set up like Infosys, and this really opened up opportunities for Indian businesses around the world. The first time you had these Indian companies setting up offices in New York, London, Tokyo, places like that. So I think that is when the growth of the Indian economy really picked up. By the late 1990s. It was the reason why the US, after slamming India with sanctions in 1998, chose very quickly after 1 year to start lifting those sanctions.
Yes, Bill Clinton came to India and onwards.
And to early 2000, he came.
Bush and Atal Bihari Vajpayee, and then Bush and Manmohan.
So again, this actually, I think, started the building of the strength that is today very essential to India's economy and India's integration with the world.
ध्रुव, यही वो वक्त था जब चाइना का राइज बहुत विजिबल था. Was this one of the major reason कि यूएस को समझ में आया कि इस रीजन में इंडिया इज देयर मोस्ट रिलायबल, क्योंकि वो पाकिस्तान में हम देखते हैं डेमोक्रेसी तो फेल है वहाँ पे.
There was some in. Again, I remember some of these debates in 2004, 3, 4, 5. There were a small group of people in the US, it was a minority, who said China is going to become a threat to the US over time. And we need to invest in other relationships, including with India. But it was a minority view, and there were still many people in the government at the time, in the US government, who believed that you need to continue engaging China. We can, through engagement and interdependence, we can make sure that China does not become a presented threat to the US. And that continued. So they were trying this dual track approach. But it was true that a lot of the investment in India by the US at this time was driven by concerns about US concerns about China.
आप किताब में कई जगह ये लिखते हैं कि अंततः विदेश नीति डोमेस्टिक पॉलिसीज, डोमेस्टिक इंटरेस्ट को फुलफिल करने के लिए, और वेरी ट्रू. पिछले कुछ वक्त में आप 3 चैलेंजेस बताते हैं, खासतौर पे 2019 ऑनवर्ड्स. वन वाज रशिया यूक्रेन कन्फ्लिक्ट, इंडिया चाइना एग्रेशन ऑन बॉर्डर, एंड थर्ड इज कोविड. इसने किस तरीके से ओवरऑल वर्ल्ड ऑर्डर को इम्पैक्ट किया, खासतौर पे इंडियन कंटेक्स्ट में?
It's funny, we don't, even now, I think we still don't know the full extent of the impact it will have.
Yes.
I think they all had, first, if you think in order, COVID first. Suddenly we found in India we couldn't produce oxygen concentrators. We weren't producing protective equipment. We were importing it all from China. So this was not, at first, this was not because China was wanting to hurt India specifically. It was everybody suddenly wanted the same equipment. So suddenly that led to a realization here that for some of these things, we need to be able to produce this domestically. And that started to happen, vaccines being a good example of that. So that was a natural disaster that led to the start of an industrial policy in some ways, a serious push towards the industrial policy. Second was the Galwan in June of 2020. And there I think the reaction was we need to not expose ourselves to China because it's a military challenge. And so technology, we had banning of apps at that time. So suddenly the technology policy became more central, more crucial.
Was there ad hocism?
No, it was a reaction to this. Now, the thing is, it happened so fast that obviously there were preparations for, we had a debate in India between people on every country is having this, by the way, between people on the economic side and economic policy people and security policy people. And what I think Galwan did was it tilted the balance in favor. This argument had been going on for some time. We cannot trust these Chinese apps. We cannot be buying these platforms from China for,
the likes of Huawei, and we were not the only one.
Not the only one.
Who were raising
but
concern. US,
Galwan
Canada.
tilted the balance in these debates in favor of security. And I think so combination of COVID plus the China clashes. And again, we are living with the consequences of that. We want to develop our own 5G stack now. The third was the Russia-Ukraine conflict in February 2022. And there, the big issue was suddenly we found very reliant on Russia for defense and spares maintenance. We needed energy. he needed fertilizer. So particularly on the defense side. So again, this led to we suddenly have a need for an industrial policy for health. Mm-hmm. We need concerns about technology penetration by China, and a need for defense self-reliance. Mm-hmm. So these three wake-up calls came. These are all issues that have been discussed before for many years. But these were the forcing mechanisms that enabled India to embark upon some of these changes that were necessary and overdue. And I think we are living mostly for the better with the consequences of that. We have seen the start of an industrial policy and the centrality of technology to national security.
नेशनल सिक्योरिटी की बात करते हैं तो बार बार चीन का जिक्र आता है और आपने ये लिखा है कि चीन वन ऑफ द फैक्टर नहीं है, इट्स द मोस्ट डोमिनेंट फैक्टर, इंक्रीजिंगली डोमिनेंट फैक्टर. चैप्टर 8 जब हम देखते हैं, आप बैलेंसिंग चाइना, एक्ट ईस्ट, किस तरीके के और कोलैबोरेशंस हैं जो आप सजेस्ट कर रहे हैं
चीन के साथ,
ईस्टर्न कंट्रीज के साथ, टू टैकल दैट थ्रेट?
नहीं, आई थिंक
क्वाड है, वो सब है, पर डू वी नीड टू रीच आउट मोर एग्रेसिवली, हैव मोर एक्टिव कोलैबोरेशन ट्रेड के पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू से, कल्चरल पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू से? क्योंकि वी लुक वेस्ट, ये बार बार ये बात कही गई है कि 47 वो कॉलोनियल हैंगओवर के पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू से ये सब कि हम लोग बहुत ज्यादा वेस्ट ड्रिवन है.
You want to have a diversity of partners. One aspect of resilience is to have a domestic capability for some things. Another aspect is just to have a diversity of partners. And so for India, again, we have two major challenges, which is China and Pakistan. Every other country, we don't have an existential difference. We have differences with Canada, we have differences with Bangladesh today, we have different, they're there. But these are not of an existential nature, so to the extent that India can have productive, constructive relations with as many other countries as possible on areas where they can provide something that is beneficial to India. Sometimes it's market access, sometimes it's natural resources, sometimes it's trade in manufactured goods, sometimes it's technology. That is better. No? So you look around, who is that? It's US, Japan. If you look east to west, US, Japan, Korea, Philippines, ASEAN, Australia, New Zealand. Then you know other smaller South Asian countries for UAE, Saudi Arabia, Israel, Iran, Russia, to the north, Central Asia. These are all countries that offer India something. And so to the extent that you can build these relations, the better. I think a part of the challenge is those countries also have their own calculations.
Yes. And
one of the, I'll give one example. I get a lot of, when I go to Southeast Asia, if you go to Singapore, Bangkok or Jakarta, the question I often get is, why are we not more economically integrated between India and Southeast Asia? Mm-hmm. And the challenge is actually that in many ways we're competing with them. So as investment, for example, investment is coming out of, particularly Western investment is coming out of China slowly. And they're looking for other places. And today, India and Southeast Asia are competing for that same
Vietnam में जाएगा कि India में आएगा?
Or Mexico, Philippines, or so sometimes we're not integrated this way because we are competing with it. And so I think they need to understand what is it that India can offer. But what we saw again with some of the trade negotiations in Southeast Asia is they want benefits on their terms, and they're sometimes not as willing to offer attractive options to India.
हमने बहुत ब्रीफली पाकिस्तान, अफगानिस्तान के बारे में बात की है, पर वेस्ट एशिया का थिएटर बहुत बड़ा है. हाँ. और वहाँ पे इंडिया की पॉलिसी की हमें ईरान से भी दोस्ती रखनी है, उन पे यूएस सैंक्शन है, लेकिन हमारी चाहे गेहूँ की डील हो या बात की डील हो, उसके बाद की है ना, पोर्ट बनाना हो वहाँ पे, और एक उसका कल्चरल और रिलीजियस कनेक्शन भी है कि इट्स अ शिया कंट्री, और हिंदुस्तान में शिया पॉपुलेशन बहुत बड़ी है और धर्मगुरु वगैरह वगैरह. इज़राइल के साथ हमें ताल्लुक़ रखना है, लेकिन हिस्टोरिकली हम पैलेस्टीनियन कॉज के साथ भी जुड़े रहे हैं, और सऊदी अरेबिया और गल्फ़ कंट्री के साथ तो बहुत एक्टिव है हमारा इन्वॉल्वमेंट, जो बढ़ा ही है. और जो आई डेयर टू से कि जिन लोगों को डिप्लोमेसी की महीन समझ नहीं है, उनको अचरज होता है, अरे साहब नरेंद्र मोदी तो हार्ड लाइन हिंदुत्व वाले लीडर हैं, पर सबसे ज़्यादा उन्हीं के टाइम पे दिख रहा है कि बहुत एक्सचेंज हो रहा है. आप इस वेस्ट एशिया थिएटर को कैसे देखते हैं?
There are some big changes happening within West Asia. within their societies.
Post-Arab Spring?
Post-Arab Spring. There's a change. I describe this in the book actually to some extent. I give some history of, particularly after the Ottoman Empire, 1914 ke baad, 1918, after 1918, how that has evolved. And right now we've seen there's a generational change. We have new young leaders in Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE. They are not wedded to some of the old orthodoxies. Their concerns about we saw in Egypt, what would a democratic country look like, and it would sometimes enable the Muslim Brotherhood and movements that these leaders sometimes are concerned about. And they share those concerns with Israel, and they share some of those concerns with India. So we're starting to see, in some ways, this coming together. They also are looking at the future of their economy, the post-oil economy. So when they look at all of this, they see in India a very important partner.
And reliable one.
I think the trust is developing. It's just started. I mean, I would put MBZ's visit to India as maybe the starting point, 2017 or so, as the starting point for many of these changes. But essentially, the product of all of this has been the Abraham Accords between Israel and UAE and Bahrain and others, which is normalization with Israel. The economic cooperation.
That's a huge shift.
It's a
1948 में अगर कोई ये चीज बोलता या 7 Day War के समय बोलता या उसके बाद के दौर में कि एक दौर ऐसा आएगा, it was unbelievable.
It's a big shift, and it again this has the potential. It's still too early to say, but it has the potential to really fundamentally transform this region. Right? And a big part, a very ambitious part of this is this creation of a India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor.
Yes.
So if it were to materialize, and some of it is subject to what's happening in Gaza, if it were to materialize fully, this really has the ability to reshape the region. But essentially, you will be in a place where India's best friends in the region will be the UAE and Israel, also their close partners, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and others. I think it leads to some questions. What would the relationship look like with Iran? It is a big question. The fact is that the importance of Iran for India in concrete terms is diminishing. It's still there because there's cooperation on Afghanistan, there's cooperation on connectivity. But compared to the Gulf, the GCC countries, it is that we don't have an Indian diaspora in Iran as we have a very large Indian diaspora in the GCC. Defense and security, better cooperation with these countries. So I think the question of Iran, I think there's also a question of Turkey as well. What can Turkey play? We've had Turkey and Pakistan have had close relations for a long time. So, and yet, again, there have been attempts to work with Turkey. India provided aid after a big earthquake 1 or 2 years back. So I think it's a region undergoing some once in a generation changes, and mostly to the benefit of India. And India needs to find how to best take advantage of it without having a negative blowback effect. So India is not interested in pushing Iran away, but how do you maintain aspects of cooperation with a country like Iran?
हम इस पे बात कर रहे हैं 10वां चैप्टर है कि कैसे इंटरनेशनल ऑर्डर रीशेप हो रहा है एंड यू यूज अ वेरी इंटरेस्टिंग टर्म फॉर इंडिया अ रिफॉर्मिस्ट पावर थोड़ा ये एक्सप्लेन करिए दर्शकों
so that I argue we have two problems with the international order. One, you have the status quo powers, US, the West. They helped construct the post World War II international order. They made themselves the decision makers because they could. They were the wealthy countries at that time. They were the powerful countries. Japan, say the ADB, to some extent even Soviet Union, then later Russia and China at the UN. So you have these are the status quo powers. They don't want to see change because any change will mean their ability to shape the rules will diminish. So they are unwilling to share space with others. At the other hand, you have countries that are trying to overturn the system completely. Mostly China and Russia, on some, not at the UN, but in other types of organizations. We're seeing this in BRICS, with financial institutions. on some issues, Iran, I suppose as well. And India is not necessarily interested in overturning all of it, because India has benefited from many aspects of this. India just wants a greater say in this order and governing it, and wants some changes, but these are not radical changes. So India belongs to a group of countries, perhaps others, but India is leading amongst them. It's a reformist power. How do we change and improve the global governance without completely destroying overturning the system? So that and so I suggest three things that India should be doing to pursue that. One is reforming existing institutions, the UN, World Bank, all that. Second is creating new institutions, some of it more informal like the Quad, some of it more formal such as the International Solar Alliance. And then the third is reaching out to the Global South, creating a coalition. And Indians understand politics. If you have 100 countries, this is a block that you can help you. If you can convince them to join you, you can actually use that to affect.
हमारे एक उस्ताद जी कहते हैं यूरोप वालों को इतने सारे रेनेसा के बाद भी यूरोपियन यूनियन चलाना नहीं आ रहा है. यूरोपियन यूनियन से ज़्यादा डाइवर्सिटी वाला इंडिया इतने सक्सेसफुली काम कर रहा है.
That's true. It's quite remarkable.
Yes. ध्रुव जयशंकर, बहुत शुक्रिया, आपने इतने विस्तार से हमसे बात की. आप देख रहे हैं किताबवाला. किताब का नाम विश्व शास्त्र. इसे पेंगुइन पब्लिकेशन ने छापा है, इंडिया एंड द वर्ल्ड. और जिन लोगों की अंतर्राष्ट्रीय संबंधों में, भारत की विदेश नीति में और एक लंबे अंतराल में ये नीति कैसे आकार लेती है और कैसे बदलती भी जाती है, इन सब में दिलचस्पी है, उन्हें 8-10 अध्यायों में बटी हुई इस किताब को ज़रूर पढ़ना चाहिए. किताबवाला का ये अंक यहीं पर समाप्त होता है. आप में से कुछ लोग खफा होंगे कि बातचीत अंग्रेज़ी में हुई, लेकिन आपको इस बात का भी ध्यान रखना होगा कि हमारे जो ऑथर हैं वो किस लैंग्वेज में ज़्यादा अपने आप को कंफर्टेबल या एक्सप्रेसिव पाते हैं. और ये हम लगातार देखते हैं. अभी लोकसभा में भी बहस चल रही थी, तब निर्मला सीतारामन जी ने भी ये चीज़ कही थी कि हम कम से कम हिंदी बोल तो ले रहे हैं, क्योंकि ऑनेस्टली स्पीकिंग नॉर्थ इंडिया से आने के बाद हम ये दावा नहीं कर सकते कि हम हिंदी अंग्रेज़ी के अलावा कोई और भारतीय भाषा बोल पाते हैं. तो आपकी नाराज़गी सर माथे पर. टेक्नोलॉजी थोड़ी सी डेवलप हो जाएगी तो हम और इफेक्टिव सबटाइटल्स देंगे. यूट्यूब पर तो होते ही हैं. पर ये बातचीत आपको कैसी लगी ज़रूर बताइए. इस तरह की बातचीत सुनिए, अपनी भाषा पर गौरव रखिए, लेकिन उस भाषा को ज्ञान के अर्जन में बाधा मत बनने दीजिए. ध्रुव जयशंकर जी, बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया, बहुत बहुत शुभकामनाएं.